Hello and welcome to episode 2 of The Man Behind the Curtain, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the LRB, and for this series I'm joined by the novelist and artist Tom McCarthy, who's talking to me about the ways in which the mechanisms and systems that underlie the novel as a form can begin to poke through and expose themselves to scrutiny by the novel itself. Is that a fair summary, Tom?
Absolutely. Or indeed, this poking through is what constitutes the novel as a kind of mode.
And this idea that these conversations are going to be structured by what you called the 5 M's, which are money, matter, machinery, mediation, and metaphor, as they join battle, as you put it, against the other big M, metaphysics. Though today we're talking about Frankenstein, so there's a 6th M for monster. And we're lucky enough to be recording this conversation in the library of the Villa Massimo, it's the German Academy in Rome, where Tom McCarthy is currently a guest. And that combination of the German and Italian seems not inappropriate as a setting for a conversation about Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the subject of our conversation today.
Very much. Here we are, British guests, of German guests, of Italian hosts, and that kind of nestling or Russian doll embedding seems to kind of mirror the circumstances in which Frankenstein first found its way into the world.
Yeah. And last time we talked about Don Quixote, and before we turn or leap ahead, I guess, to Frankenstein, I think the place you want to begin, Tom, is in Cervantes' novel, in that inn that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza keep returning to as guests, not always very well treated guests. So we're going to briefly return to that inn too.
Yes, we spent so much time in that inn last time, as do Quixote and Panza. And while they're in the inn, and a typical scene of there's some violence and fighting going on in one room, and Quixote is swooning and having one of his fits, and Panza is trying to manage it. And Cervantes kind of pans away to show this dialogue between a canon and a priest, I think. And they're discussing forms of fiction. And the canon says, when it comes to discuss chivalric fiction, he says, I've never seen a book of chivalry that could be regarded as a whole body, complete with all its members, and in which the middle corresponds with the beginning and the end with the beginning and the middle. On the contrary, their authors give them so many members that their intention seems more to produce a chimera or a monster than a well-proportioned figure. That's, this appears in the beginning of the 17th century. But if we fast forward 200 years to 1816, we find a young couple, Mary Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley, reading Don Quixote together in the first half of that year. And then in the summer of that year, the year without summer, because of the Mount Tambora eruption that changed the world's climate for quite a stretch, they find themselves in the Villa Diodati, in the village of Colony near Geneva. Mary's already taken the surname Shelley, but they'll marry later that year. They're with their son William, who will soon die. They've already lost one premature child. They're going to lose another between those two. They've got Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont with them, who will later have an affair with Percy. They've got Byron with them, who has impregnated Claire already by this point, and his doctor/writer friend John Polidori. So it's quite a convoluted menagerie already. And because they can't really go out much because the weather's so bad, they spend a lot of time indoors telling each other ghost stories and discussing developments in science. So when Mary comes to describe the origins of the book that she will write as a direct kind of outcome of these conversations in the intro to the standard edition of 1831, she cites Don Quixote. She says everything must have a beginning, to speak in Sanchian phrase. She's referring to the one of Sancho Panza's typically stupid but actually quite insightful comments when he's in book 2, he's reflecting on governance. He says, in this matter of government, everything depends upon the beginning. And Mary continues, invention, it must be humbly admitted, does not consist in creating out of void, but out of chaos. The materials must, in the first place, be afforded. It can give form to dark, shapeless substances, but cannot bring into being the substance itself.
Well, she's talking about her book, isn't she?
Yeah, she's talking about Frankenstein.
But the way in which, I mean, it's one of those things which, famously, Frankenstein is not the name of the creature, which doesn't have a name. We shouldn't have to say that. And yet, when people think of Frankenstein, they do think of the creature because, it's the famous thing, and it's he needs a name, and his namelessness is actually quite an important part of, his creator's failing, it seems to me. But that, we can maybe come to that later. But also the way in which she sees the book, which does have the name Frankenstein, is a creature that she has made in a similar manner to the way that Victor
by
Frankenstein
putting members together
has made his creature. So in that sense, the novel and the monster are so similar, and the novel is called Frankenstein. So the creature being called Frankenstein, being referred to in that way, maybe isn't such a mistake as it's sometimes said to be.
Not at all. And it's interesting, in that same introduction, she talks kind of in the same breath, in the same sentence almost, of galvanism gifting life to a corpse and imagination gifting images to her mind with what she calls a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. And she describes her visions when she'd thought of the idea for the story of her picturing Victor Frankenstein, who she calls the artist, recoiling at his creation. In fact, when prior to this, preparing for this discussion, I was remembering the book, and I misremembered that Mary pictures Frankenstein, the inventor, pulling back the curtain to stare at his monster. But in fact, when I actually reread it just a couple of weeks ago, I realized it's exactly the other way around. It's the monster pulling back the curtains to peer at Frankenstein with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. And Mary signs off her introduction by saying, I bid my hideous progeny, by which she means the book, go forth and prosper.
Yeah. That the body of the creature is put together out of different body parts that are assembled into a new and monstrous whole. That, as you say, Percy and Mary were reading Don Quixote together, or possibly Percy was reading it aloud. And in her notes to Percy's poems of 1816, which Mary, that after his death, she sort of became his executor and publisher and bowdlerizer in some ways, but she wrote, it was his frequent habit to read out loud to me in the evening. In this way, we read this year the New Testament, Paradise Lost, Spenser's Faerie Queen, and Don Quixote. And in a sense, these are some of the bodies that she's taken the parts from and reassembled them into this new form of life, this new form of writing that she's created. I think there's that sense everyone knows what Frankenstein's about. So there's the scientist, the mad scientist creates the monster who then destroys everything he loves. But I think I may just try and rattle through a quick plot summary so that, for people who perhaps had forgotten who it is who pulls back the curtain on the bed to look at the figure below. So, you've talked about how we hear the sort of Russian doll are nested, the British guests, the German guests, the Italians, and the novel is a series of nested first-person accounts, isn't it? So we begin with this young man, Robert Walton, he's on a voyage of discovery, hoping to find the North Pole and discover the secrets of magnetism and so on. And he's writing home to his beloved sister, Margaret. And while his ship's trapped in the ice, and they rescue a man on a sledge, who seems to be, traveling. Well, they've already seen this one figure on a sledge and then this other one, and he's on an ice floe and in danger of drowning, and they rescue him. And this is Victor Frankenstein. And he then begins to tell his story to Walton. And he was born in Geneva. He's engaged to marry his cousin, Elizabeth. Then he goes to study in Ingolstadt. And there his scientific inquiries lead him to discover the secret of life, which he refuses to share with Walton, which is obviously a bit of a very handy trick for a science fiction writer that actually had this impossible secret I'm not going to tell you. But he also, within the story, he has very good reasons, as will become clear, for not sharing it. And he makes this creature out of body parts and brings it to life. Then he's immediately horrified by his creation, as you said, and he flees from it. And he falls ill, and he's looked after by his friend Henry or Henri Clerval. And when he begins to recover, he gets a letter from his father saying that his younger brother William, has been murdered. And Victor immediately suspects the creature of this. But there's a young woman that the family has taken in called Justine, and she's charged with the crime and executed. And Victor's back in Geneva by now, and then he encounters the creature on an alpine glacier, this amazing scene up in the mountains and on the ice. And then there, the creature, who has learned to speak, tells Victor his story. So we're now at the third first-person narrator at the sort of centre of the story. And he says what happened after Victor fled from him. And he took shelter in a sort of lean-to against a house, and he spied on the family that lived inside the house. The Delacies, a French family who they've fallen on hard times, and he eventually sums up courage to introduce himself to them, and they, as Victor did, they recoil from him in horror, rejected once again. He has come to Victor and asked him to make himself a female companion, a creature like him who won't reject him the way that other people have. And at first, Victor agrees to this. He goes to the Orkneys to make another creature, but then he becomes so repelled by what he's doing that he destroys his work. And the creature watching this enraged, and he says to him, "I will be with you on your wedding night." And then he kills Victor's friend, Henri Clerval, at sea. And then somehow Victor ends up in Ireland where he's accused of the crime, but then he produces his alibi and he's let go, and he goes home to Geneva. And there he marries Elizabeth. And on their wedding night, the creature, spoiler alert, but I think everyone probably knows this, the creature murders her. And at this point, the pursuit changes direction, and the hunter becomes the hunted. And Victor pursues the creature to the Arctic, and that's where he enters our story and meets Walton. And then Victor dies, I think, of illness or sort of exhaustion.
Exhaustion, distress.
Stories come to an end. And then the creature appears on the ship, so proof that Victor's story is real. Talks to Walton and then says that now that his creator's dead and he's destroyed everything, then he's going to destroy himself. And he leaps from the cabin window and disappears into the darkness and the distance. So there we are. And if people don't remember every detail, and obviously I've left out plenty of details, some of which we will come to later. But so in that sense, that Frankenstein is about as I say, a scientist creates a monster that goes on to destroy everything dear to him. But what else is it about, Tom? Or, what's it really about?
It's about technology. It's about incest. It's about mourning. It's about politics. It's about knowledge. I think she's hit on such a central vein in culture and society that it keeps accumulating things to be, about that didn't even exist, i.e. weren't formed when she wrote it. But perhaps at this point, it might be more useful to kind of rejig the question and ask, well, what does it do? What form does it take? How does it organize itself? Because I think if we ask this, then we will also strike on an artery that's going to really open up the novel for us and reveal its workings.
Okay. So how does it organize itself? What is the secret that Victor won't share with Walton?
Well, the kind of secret elixir, the mechanism at the heart of the novel, it takes the form or the procedure of a series of doublings, of duplications and proliferations of a single core subject or structure or formation, which is that of the family.
In the sense that the Frankenstein family, the happy Frankenstein family, cousin Elizabeth, Justine's brought in. Yeah. So, I mean, it isn't, as it were, a nuclear family, is it? Exactly. Not even in the terms of the early 19th century. No,
I mean, the family has been the basic organizational kind of unit of Western society, and the basic kind of thematic unit of literature ever since the Greeks, and if we think of, the Greek, the cycles, they're always about a house, the house of Thebes in the Theban cycle, the house of Atreus in the Orestean cycle. It's about the house in its expanded sense, house meaning, the family, the estate. The Greek word for house is oikos, which is the root of economics, oikonomia. So it's kind of conceived so economics is originally conceived as the kind of expanded domain of a house, of a patriarchal household, expanded beyond the physical borders of a house through systems of, exchange and credit and debt and so on. And the kind of gimmick that authors have used from the Greeks onwards is to set the family up and then start complicating it and indeed unraveling it and destroying this kind of structure. And this is, I think, exactly what's going on in Frankenstein, but not just in a single setting, but duplicated and permutated 5 or 6 or 7 times in this kind of nested way. So, inside, the main story is about the ruination of the house of Frankenstein, this very established Genovese family. So Victor says to Robert at the beginning of his account to him, he says, "My family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation." But interestingly, right at the beginning of that story, Shelley kind of peels off a double of the father in the form of his friend, his business associate friend, Beaufort, who's in an exactly identical situation to the Frankenstein patriarch, but as a merchant falls into ruin and leaves public life. And the Frankenstein father, who also never gets a name, goes and hunts him down in Lucerne and finds him in complete ruin, in fact, having just died and being wept over by his young, presumably teenage daughter, Caroline, who he swoops up and marries, kind of adopts into his family. And then almost immediately, Shelley duplicates within this duplication. So she has Caroline visiting the villages of the poor around their home, and she encounters another orphan, Elizabeth, who is the daughter, again, of a Milanese nobleman fallen into poverty, and her foster parents, these kind of country folk, were quite well off, but have fallen into poverty. So she's kind of scooped up by Caroline, who presents her initially not as Victor's cousin, but as he says, my more than sister. So that's already like 3 duplications around this. Then it's duplicated again with Justine, who you mentioned. Her father dies. Her mother feels revulsion towards her, which doubles Victor's revulsion for the monster. So she's kind of adopted into the Frankenstein family as a servant / sister. But then she also, when Caroline then dies, quite young, Justine comes to double her. So Elizabeth, the first cousin / sister, says of her, "She endeavoured to imitate Caroline's phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me, Elizabeth, of her, Caroline." So we're at kind of 4 permutations on this basic kind of slightly rejigged family structure. And then, as you mentioned, the monster, when he's living in his lean-to, spying on this family and learning language and culture and so on, the de Lacy family are yet again another formerly wealthy household afflicted by poverty, as the monster says.
And also without a mother, that these dead mothers,
Absolutely.
of course, that Mary...
Always the dead mother.
Yeah, that Mary Shelley's own mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died giving birth to her. So there's...
Right.
Without getting sort of too biographical about the criticism, this figure of the dead mother is obviously very important.
Absolutely central, right? And so, and Mary, in her introduction, she this is yet another. I mean, so we've got within the main story, we've got 5 or 6. I've lost count already. It's like 6 permutations of this kind of unraveled, rejigged family. Around the main story, you've got the polar explorer Robert Walton writing to his sister Margaret. Again, they're orphan. They've been transferred to the household of their uncle, and the older sister again doubles as a proxy mother. So Robert says, "I spent my early years under your gentle and feminine fosterage." But then Robert adopts Victor and says I begin to love him as a brother. And absolutely, then it happens around the book. So Mary in her intro says, she asks, "Is it not singular that as the daughter of 2 persons of distinguished literary celebrity, I should very early in life have thought of writing? My husband was from the first very anxious that I should prove myself worthy of my parentage and enroll myself on the page of fame." So this is the kind of frame and envelope and content of everything, the family, but the kind of complicated family with dead mothers and duplicated semi-siblings who are cousins and so on. These kind of, it repeats inwards and outwards and at every level of the scale, kind of recursively, with all the positions and configurations being kind of transposed. So with the collapse of one oikos, one household, its parts just get transferred onto another or assigned different places within a kind of new version of the same. And the point is, as you intimated, with all these repetitions and duplications and transfers, it gets confusing. It gets corrupted, to use the kind of language of digital technology, right? We get crossed wires. We get people in the wrong position or a doubling position. So Elizabeth, who's, Victor initially calls her my more than sister, but then, oh yes, Elizabeth, the more than sister, calls her brother Victor first my cousin, and then her father uncle and mother aunt, but then she gets redesignated by Caroline when she dies as the mother to her own siblings, and then when she writes to Victor, she calls their younger siblings our dear children, right? And then at Justine's trial, she says of William, the dead child, I am the cousin of the unhappy child, or rather his sister. But then she calls Justine my sister as well. So it gets very corrupted. That file is corrupted as hell.
Yeah. Although there's something actually very realistic about that, because there is the sort of the fantasy of the family where the father and the mother and the children and everyone, it's all very straightforward and everything in its place, and the family tree goes down very neatly. And real families aren't like that. That real families are actually the idealized platonic family, as it were, doesn't really exist. And actually these Frankenstein families are what all families are really like.
Absolutely right. Yeah, no, for sure. And I think within that whole kind of situation, the monster almost serves as a kind of embodiment of this fact. He's the kind of he's the catalyst. He's the agent. He's the accelerator of all these denuclearizing of the family, right? I mean, he's the one that killed William. He's the one that frames Justine for killing William. He's like this kind of viral glitch created by the overworking of the system, or he's this like anti-oikonomic agent who returns to the oikos and destroys it, bit by bit, or destroys the fantasy of the kind of simple nuclear family. And it really is about, the downfall of the house. So after William's murder, Victor writes, my father's tears and the desolation of that late so smiling home. And Elizabeth says, now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. So, the catastrophe isn't so much the death of the child, it's the ruination of the oikos, of the house.
Yeah. But by a figure who in some sense could have been another, if we accept that they take all sorts of people into their family and become members of the family. And there is a sense in which the monster is Victor's child.
Yeah.
He's sort of made him, and it should be that, okay, comes home, hey guys, this is Jeff, the monster I've made, given him a name, and he's now part of the family too. This is my new brother. I mean, there is a version of obviously that wouldn't have done so well or taken hold of everyone's imagination in the way that this story has, but where Victor loves the creature, welcomes it into the family, and everyone lives happily ever after.
The Addams Family version, the happy family with monsters.
Yeah.
The kind of absolutely. But I think the reason this can't work within the novel is not just in order to actually be able to generate the novel, but I think it's a marker for a deeper contradiction within the structure of the family, or a deeper problem, which is the problem of incest. I think this is the kind of core of all of this. The monster is really just a marker for this toxin at the heart of the oikos, right? Which is incest, right? So ever since, it's kind of axiomatic in the world of anthropology, whether it's Levi-Strauss or Margaret Mead or Malinowski or whoever we read, they all concur on the fact that the incest taboo is absolutely the fundamental kind of maneuver in the formation of the family. And for Freud in works like Totem and Taboo or Moses and Monotheism, he sees it as the constitutive kind of move. The prohibition of incest is the constitutive move in the formation of modern civilization. So it's built around this paradox that, because for Freud, incest in the form of the Oedipus complex is actually what's most intimate or most primal to the human, or at least the male human drive, but it's the very thing that must be suppressed or displaced onto the institution of exogamous marriage in order for the family and civilization to kind of survive or prosper. So it's this kind of paradox, the expulsion of what's most intimate. And I think one of the central things Shelley's doing in Frankenstein is really unpacking that or amplifying that paradox, and letting it all go wrong. That maneuver, just, they drop the baton over and over again.
I mean, that question of incest, and especially, I mean, the brother-sister incest, which Victor's very brief marriage, or perhaps unconsummated marriage to Elizabeth, is a kind of incestuous.
Absolutely.
As you've been talking about how they think of each other as brother and sister, and then they get married. But one of the things that's quite interesting about this attitude, that Percy, that summer in 1816, when the Shelleys and Byron and Polidori all agreed to write ghost stories, and Mary was the only one who actually went ahead and did it so amazingly. After that, they went back to England, and they were living in Marlow on the Thames in Buckinghamshire, this sort of very, I don't know, sort of home counties life that is. And where Mary was finishing Frankenstein. And as she was finishing it, Percy was beginning work on this, his longest poem. And it's nearly 5,000 words long, and he wrote it in about 6 months. And it's many ways unreadable in the way that Mary is such a brilliant storyteller and Percy's a terrible storyteller. His first title was Léon and Cisna, and it's a sort of allegory of the French Revolution, but also which has this brother-sister incest at its heart. I mean, he then later rewrote it, published it as The Revolt of Islam, and took out the incest because it was, a bit much for everyone. But there's this bit, which I'm just going to read 6 lines of the 5,000. And this is when the brother and sister get together. And few were the living hearts which could unite like ours, or celebrate a bridal night with such close sympathies. For to each other had high and solemn hopes, the gentle might of earliest love, and all the thoughts which smother cold evil's power, now linked a sister and a brother. So Percy has this kind of, he was very close to his sisters as a child. And I think, and one of the things he was, briefly found in his marriages and other relationships with women was hoping to find was this kind of idealized, what more sort of the equality of a sibling relationship, but with someone who it's okay to have sex with. And it, but it's not clear that Mary had such a, certainly based on Frankenstein, Mary perhaps didn't feel quite the same way about this as he did.
Mary will later write this book called Matilda, which is about father-daughter incest. She wrote the manuscript and sent it naturally to her father, who said, "This is disgusting, don't publish it." And it wasn't published till, I think, 1959. Byron, who's staying with them, has almost certainly just had a baby with his half-sister Augusta Lee. He writes in a letter, "If the baby is an ape, that will be my fault." Right? So yes, no, incest is very much hovering around this, but in that sense, I mean, the real kind of tragic heroes of the novel are not Victor, but the parents, right? I mean, the patriarch, the matriarch, who want to continue this kind of good social practice of oikos formation, but their fatal flaw, their hamartia, to use the Aristotelian tragic theory phrase, is to found this aspiration on incest rather than against it, right? So Caroline, on her very deathbed, says to Victor and Elizabeth, "My dear children," right? Not my child and my niece. "My dear children, my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union." So Elizabeth is designated not just as a mother to her own siblings, like Margaret is to Robert the Explorer, but a wife to her brother. I mean, she's been repeatedly described as his sister. And then the father compounds this. He says, "I have always looked forward to your marriage with our dear Elizabeth as the tie of our domestic comfort." I mean, that's the fatal kind of flaw. So the horror, this is the horror at the heart of the book. It's not monstrosity, it's incest, right?
And is there a sense in which Victor, he goes to Ingolstadt to university, and there's a sense in which he's somehow fleeing this incestuous household, and in his teachers he finds new father figures, and he, by making this creature out of dead bodies, is a kind of a form of asexual reproduction, that somehow he's trying to make himself the patriarch of some new. So in a sense, this all grows out of his attempt to flee this incestuous Swiss household and to,
Yeah, but you can run, but you can't hide. I mean, he flees, he creates the monster, and then immediately he kind of exhausted and overwhelmed, he kind of faints or falls asleep, and he has this dream, and Shelley writes, and Victor says, "I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt." She's in Geneva, several hundred kilometers away, but he sees her walking in the streets of Ingolstadt, delighted and surprised. I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I mean, it's a double whammy, left, right, sister and mother, and a double taboo, not just incest, but the other formative prohibition, which is around death. So the monster is almost like a reverse McCavity, T.S. Eliot's cat that's never there at the scene of the crime. The monster is always there. It's like at the scene of incest, he's like a kind of, it's aura, or the other way around. Incest is the aura of him. I mean, wherever there is incest, there is the monster, and vice versa.
And what about this family, the de Lacys, which is where, having been rejected by his father figure, the monster, Victor flees the monster goes off and tries to find a new family. And so he ends up in this sort of extraordinary and sort of slightly unlikely, and yet she makes it convincing enough when you're reading it. He's sort of hiding in this shed attached to the side of the de Lacys' house and spying. There's a sort of a chink in the wall where he gets to spy on them. And I mean, is this incest? Is that an incestuous household as well?
Well, he learns their names as father, sister or Agatha, Felix, brother or son. Felix has this love. There's a very Cervantian kind of embedded story of Felix's doomed love for his beautiful Arabian bride who he helped to flee from Paris, and this is kind of why they're in poverty now. It's a nuclear family, and as you mentioned earlier, the monster eventually, having learnt language and been very compassionate towards them, he brings them wood and he kind of helps them out in this anonymous way. But when he presents himself to them, they're absolutely repulsed. They feel revulsion, and then the monster's reaction to that immediately is firstly he goes and hunts down Victor's family and kills the younger brother William, but then he presents himself to Victor and says, make me a sister. I mean, Shelley doesn't use that word because it would be too obvious, but the monster, Frankenstein, is his creator. If he creates another one, this is his sister effectively. And again, Victor complies. He calls this my engagement. My engagement is to make this female monster. And he's almost completed the task when he sees the monster looking in from outside with this kind of lascivious, eager eyes. And he's so repulsed by this, not by all the flesh that he's working on. He's repulsed by incest. Incest is more monstrous than a monster.
The monster's looking in on his sister bride-to-be, and that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you get this other doubling or inversion of that, where Victor is then meant to marry his cousin / more than sister, and the monster, does a tit for tat destruction of Elizabeth before the act can be consummated. And in a Kantian sense, the monster is good at that moment. He stands for the moral law, for the greater good. He prevents the real horror, which would be the consummation of an incestuous relationship.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.